Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody is doing okay. So, beginning this week, what's going to happen in the course is I'm going to discuss the transition of Texas from a Spanish colony to a U.S. slave state. Now, you've already encountered that in Torjay, or hopefully you will by the time you take the quiz this week. But that's one of the great transitions in Texas history and one of the most important transitions. And it's something that I think is kind of taken for granted. And I've said that before. It's just kind of assumed that Texas would become a part of the US. And one of the things I want to do in this story or in this course is tell that story and flesh out the detail of it. I think it's very, very interesting and very, very significant. It has a Comanche dimension. So that's the big transition this week. We're going from Spain. Spain is kicked out of North America in 1821. Then, for a period of 15 years, Texas is Mexican. And then, of course, in 1836, Texas becomes an independent nation. I guess the thing that bothers me is that for a lot of folks, year zero in Texas history is 1836 with the Texas Revolution. And there's just so much that happened before 1836 that helps define Texas today. And I want you coming out of the class realizing what happened. And also, it's during this period that we get the introduction of slavery into Texas, beginning in the 1820s when Anglos start pouring into Texas. And that is the beginning of the African American population in Texas. So it's a very significant period. But for now, let me just recap some points that I've made, probably for some of you too much, but I'm a big believer in repetition, which is, I've repeated that a lot too. Texas is a border region. I have a map up here. The borders aren't well defined, especially the northeastern border of Texas or even the western border. But beginning with LaSalle, washing ashore in Matagorda Bay, we have about 100-year period where the Spanish pay close attention to Texas when they feel like they're about to lose it to France. They're about to cede territory to France. The Spanish are super paranoid about the French next door. And then when there are periods where the Spanish aren't really too worried about the French, that they retrench, that they try to cut costs, that they withdraw some of their men from Texas. So you have this cycle of kind of attention and resources being given into Texas. Aguayo coming in the 1720s is one of the great examples of that. And then retrenchment, just kind of pulling back. So that's the overall story. In 1763, something happens, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, although it is pretty interesting. But 1763, there's the end of a global war. And if you remember your U.S. history, it's the French and Indian War. Canada, this is when Canada becomes part of England. So there's this big global war that goes on that ends in 1763. And Texas gets caught up in the war in this sense. As part of the settlement of 1763, for reasons that I am not going to go into detail about because I'm kind of fuzzy on the details myself, but let's just get to the point here. Long story short, Louisiana becomes Spanish in 1763 as part of the big peace treaty after the end of this war. And so the significance of Texas is that from 17, well, on here it says 1762, let's just go 1760s to about 1800. Louisiana now is Spanish for about a period of 40 years. And that has very interesting ramifications for Texas because suddenly now Texas is no longer a border province. The border of Spain in North America is now the Mississippi River, not Texas. So I think you can kind of figure out that once Texas is no longer a border province, Spain's going to pay less attention to Texas. Okay. So I just want to say one real quick thing about that 40-year period in which Louisiana is Spanish. It's a really significant period for Louisiana. The French Quarter in New Orleans, although it's called the French Quarter, actually is built during the Spanish period. And a lot of the architecture there is Spanish architecture. And so, once again, Spain has a big influence on our neighboring state, Louisiana. Okay, so long story short, early 1760s to about 1800, um, uh, Louisiana has become Spanish. Texas is no longer a border region because the border has moved east to the Mississippi. And what the Spanish try to do beginning in the 1760s is save money and consolidate their resources and cut back their resources in Texas. So this is a big moment in Texas history. It's part of this moment where I talked about secularization by the 1780s. The Spanish government, 1790s really, the Spanish government is secularizing the missions. And the word secular in today's language means non-religious. What it means in this context is the mission stayed religious, but they just weren't getting any government support. And by the 1790s, most of the Indians that had gone into the missions, sadly, most of them had died of disease. The missions weren't in great shape. And then on top of it, the Spanish government stopped supporting the missions. The priests are still there, but the Spanish government isn't supporting them. So what happens is the missions basically are deserted. And by the time of the Alamo, most of the missions are ruins. People are using the stones from the mission to build fences. Cattle literally are being stored in some of the missions. So the missions go downhill pretty quick, beginning in the 1790s when the Spanish government starts to pull its support. Now, one of the other things that happens during this period, the Spanish try to withdraw completely from East Texas. uh, they force the Spaniards that live in East Texas, or the Tejanos, they force them back into San Antonio. There's a big protest, and the Spanish government in Mexico City actually gives in, and the Tejanos are allowed to go back into East Texas, and that's the period that we get Nacogdoches. So what happens again, the Spanish try to force their settlers in East Texas out of there because the Spanish don't want to have to deal with protecting them. They're forced to go to San Antonio. They protest. Surprisingly, the government in Mexico City listens to their protests, allows them to go back into East Texas, and that's how we get Nacogdoches. In Nacogdoches, the reason that the settlers wanted to be there is that they're trading horses with the into Louisiana. So there's a very large ranching industry in Nacogdoches. So by 1800, we have the three cities that still exist that were created during the Spanish period. San Antonio, of course, Goliad, where the La Bahia mission is, and Nacogdoches. Those are the three Spanish cities that created during the Spanish period that still exist today. Now that's something that I feel like I could test you on. So you might want to make a note of that.